All right, buckle up everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into the whirlwind of Canadian politics and economics. We've got a mountain of sources to sift through: news articles, reports, and the big one, a truly eye-opening interview with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau himself.
You hit the nail on the head, Canada, right now. It's like a crossroads, wouldn't you say? So many challenges, both at home and on the global scene. And all eyes are on Trudeau and his government to see how they'll handle it all.
Absolutely. So let's break it down, shall we? We're talking everything from the affordability crisis that's hitting Canadians hard to those tense diplomatic relations with India, even Trudeau's thoughts on a possible Trump comeback. Oh, and can't forget his take on the ever-evolving situation in the Middle East.
It's almost dizzying when you think about how intertwined all these issues are. The anxieties here in Canada, they're shaping Trudeau's political strategies, and that, in turn, affects his approach to foreign policy. It's a real web, and we're here to untangle it thread by thread.
Sounds like a plan. So let's start with the issue that's hitting Canadians right where it hurts their wallets. High interest rates, the whole mortgage renewal crunch looming over everyone is creating a lot of anxiety, and people are definitely looking to the government for some relief.
Yeah.
So what did Trudeau have to say about all this in the interview?
Well, he's treading carefully, that's for sure. He's putting a spotlight on the mortgage charter as a potential solution, allowing Canadians to renegotiate their mortgages, maybe lower those monthly payments, and he's emphasizing those efforts to boost housing supply, but, well, we all know that's a long game, right? Not much help for those struggling right now.
And that's where the criticism comes in, I imagine. We've seen articles highlighting that many Canadians feel the government's response just hasn't been enough to address the immediate pain of these rising costs.
Exactly. And one of the economic reports we've got really digs into the global inflation picture. It highlights, for example, how the UK is actually grappling with even higher inflation than us. So while there are limits to what any single government can do to control a global phenomenon, that doesn't really soften the blow for Canadians facing those skyrocketing prices at the grocery store, does it?
Food inflation, definitely a pain point, and Trudeau doesn't shy away from that. He points to things like the grocery rebate and those childcare cost reductions as ways the government's trying to lighten the load. But what do you make of these measures? Are they actually addressing the root causes of this inflation, or is it more like putting a bandage on a bigger wound?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And you can't talk about this without mentioning Pierre Poilievre, the conservative leader. He's really tapping into that public frustration, isn't he? Essentially arguing that it's Trudeau's policies, particularly that carbon tax, that are making everything more expensive.
And how does Trudeau counter that?
Well, his argument is that Poilievre is basically just amplifying anxieties without actually bringing any concrete alternatives to the table. He is implying that the Conservatives are all talk, no action, just pointing fingers without a real plan.
It all makes you think about how hard it must be to communicate complex policy solutions in a world that thrives on sound bites and headlines, right? Nuance gets lost in the noise.
It really does. There's a political analyst we came across who made this really interesting point. He was saying that it's almost impossible to get those nuanced policy solutions across when you're up against these emotionally charged, simplistic messages that just play on people's fears. And these solutions often involve compromise. They don't offer instant gratification. Hard to sell that in a world that wants everything now.
Let's zoom in on a specific policy that seems to be at the heart of this debate: the carbon tax. There's been a lot of back and forth, especially around that exemption for home heating oil in certain provinces. Trudeau's rationale is that it's meant to help those lower-income families, especially in Atlantic Canada and rural areas, who rely on that heating oil and are feeling the pinch of rising energy costs more acutely.
Right, and this is where the political analysis gets really interesting. Some suggest that while, yes, this exemption might genuinely help some families, it also conveniently benefits those living in provinces with, shall we say, strategically important electoral districts, those swing seats that could determine the next election. It makes you wonder, is this genuine concern for affordability, or is there a bit of political maneuvering going on here?
It's like Trudeau's trying to walk this tightrope between policy and politics. In the interview, he does say that, responding to people's problems is kind of baked into the nature of politics. But is that enough to justify a decision that seems to have some contradictions?
That's the question, isn't it? We have to remember how this whole carbon tax and rebate system works. The idea is to make those polluting fuels pricier, right? Encourage people to switch to cleaner options while offering those rebates to help offset the increased cost. But the problem is there's a real patchwork of ways Canadians heat their homes. Some rely more heavily on certain fuels, and then you factor in regional differences. So, while the exemption might genuinely help some families struggling to make ends meet, you have to ask, what about the impact on those emissions reduction goals? Does it undermine the effectiveness of the carbon tax as a whole?
So, genuine attempt to ease the burden or a calculated move to stay in voters' good graces. That's the debate. And it really underscores that constant tension between environmental goals and economic realities.
Exactly. Phasing out fossil fuels? It's critical, obviously, if we're serious about tackling climate change. But it comes with real-world costs that have to be managed carefully. Look at Canada's success in phasing out coal. It shows it can be done. But it takes that delicate balance of policy incentives, technological advancements, public support, this whole home heating oil exemption. It just throws another wrench into that already complicated
A
equation.
lot to chew on already, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
Next up, we're venturing into the world of foreign policy, where things get even more intricate. Buckle up.
It's funny, that push and pull between economic realities and political pressures that we see in the carbon tax debate, it kind of plays out on the global stage, too. Think about the whole controversy with those leaked intelligence reports, the ones suggesting Chinese interference in Canadian elections.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. Didn't Trudeau kind of brush those reports aside initially? But the whole thing really raised some eyebrows, right? About foreign interference and how the government's handling these kinds of threats.
Absolutely. And what's striking is that despite those allegations, and they were pretty serious, nobody's been charged with leaking that information, which, is highly classified stuff.
That's a good point. Makes you wonder what's going on behind closed doors.
It really highlights that whole struggle, right?
Yeah.
Balancing national security concerns with transparency and accountability.
Yeah.
You need to protect sensitive intelligence, but at the same time, the public deserves to know if there are legitimate threats to the integrity of their elections.
No doubt about it. That's a tough balancing act. And speaking of balancing acts, the diplomatic tensions with India after the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada, that's put Trudeau in a really tricky spot. What did the interview reveal about how he's navigating that whole situation?
Well, it's a delicate situation, to say the least. Trudeau's been pretty clear, stating his confidence in the intelligence suggesting that the Indian government was involved in that assassination. And those are not accusations you throw around lightly, especially when you're dealing with a country like India, a major economic and strategic partner for Canada.
High stakes, for sure. In the interview, Trudeau emphasized that Canada doesn't want to pick a fight with India, but they're not going to compromise on principles of safety and justice. Sounds like he's trying to walk a very fine line.
He is. One of the foreign policy experts we read made a really interesting point. He said, this situation perfectly illustrates the challenge of upholding the rule of law while also maintaining these crucial diplomatic and economic relationships. If Canada alienates India, that could have some serious consequences. But so could ignoring a potential state-sponsored assassination that happened right here on Canadian soil. It's a real dilemma.
No easy answers there. But Trudeau did mention a possible shift in India's position. He seemed to suggest they might be more open to working with the investigation now. What do you make of that?
That could be significant for sure. If India is genuinely signaling a willingness to engage, it could really open the door to de-escalating the situation and, finding some kind of resolution. But it's still early days. We need to see how things actually play out.
Okay, so from one complex foreign policy issue to another, let's turn our attention to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East.
Here, too, we see that same need for balance. We've seen a noticeable change in the Canadian government's stance. Initially, they were calling for those humanitarian pauses, but now it's evolved into a more forceful call for a sustained ceasefire.
And that shift hasn't been without its critics. Some, including some Jewish Canadians, argue that there shouldn't be any talk of a ceasefire until Hamas releases all the hostages and disarms. They see that as a non-negotiable starting point for any kind of lasting peace.
And to really grasp that perspective, you have to consider the whole history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's just so much mistrust on both sides. Any perceived concession, it's often seen as a weakness that can be exploited. And then you have the hostage issue, which is especially sensitive, right? It brings up all those memories of past conflicts, the fear of loved ones being held captive. It cuts deep.
So where does Trudeau stand amidst all these strong, often opposing viewpoints?
Well, he acknowledges that urge, for Israel to take decisive action to protect its citizens, prevent future attacks. He gets that. But he also expresses concern that the current approach, while it might work in the short term, could actually make things worse in the long run. Jeopardize long-term peace and stability in the region. He even suggests it could undermine international support for a Jewish state. It's a nuanced perspective, recognizing that the conflict is complex and any solution has to address those underlying causes of violence and distrust.
Sounds like Trudeau and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu aren't exactly seeing eye to eye on the way forward. In the interview, Trudeau mentioned a conversation they had where they disagreed on the whole two-state solution thing.
Right, and that just underscores how incredibly difficult it is to navigate these kinds of entrenched conflicts. You've got those competing narratives, the historical grievances, that lack of trust on all sides. Finding a way to bridge those divides, create the conditions for genuine, lasting peace, it's a Herculean task.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you throw in the potential for a major shakeup in global politics. Trudeau didn't hold back in expressing his concerns about a possible Trump comeback.
It speaks to that wider anxiety, doesn't it, about the state of democracy, not just in the U.S., but around the world. A second Trump presidency that could have huge implications for everything: trade, climate change, foreign policy. And for Canada, sharing a border with the U.S., the stakes are even higher.
It's interesting how Trudeau kind of pivots from those global anxieties to reflecting on his own political future. He talks about those personal challenges he's faced recently, the separation from his wife, and he frames it as a renewed commitment to building a better future for his kids, finishing the work his government started.
It's classic reframing, isn't it? Acknowledging the difficulties, personal and political, while projecting that image of resilience, determination, renewed purpose. But will it resonate with voters? That's the big question.
The million-dollar question, indeed. Some of those political commentators we read argue that Trudeau's really banking on that inherent Canadian optimism. That belief that even when things are tough, we can pull together and overcome challenges. And he's highlighting his government's accomplishments, right? Pointing to progress on childcare, climate change, economic growth.
But let's not forget the other side of the coin. The Conservatives, with Poilievre at the helm, they're hammering away at that affordability crisis. They're painting a picture of Canadians struggling to keep their heads above water, feeling like they're falling behind, while Trudeau's focused on the global stage. And that message, it's simple, it's emotionally powerful, potentially very effective. It's a real nail-biter, isn't it? Predicting elections. Never easy. But we can look at the pieces on the board, right? Trudeau's trying to project that I've been through the ringer, but I'm still here kind of image, especially after the separation. But is that going to be enough for voters who are feeling disillusioned, maybe fed up with the cost of living or just ready for something different?
That's the question, isn't it? It seems like he's putting a lot of faith in that Canadian we can do it spirit. The idea that even when times are tough, we pull together, we find a way. And of course, he's touting his government's accomplishments, the progress on childcare, climate change, economic growth.
But you can't ignore the other guys, right? The Conservatives, with Poilievre leading the charge, they're hitting that affordability drum hard, painting a picture of Canadians struggling to put food on the table, to keep up, while Trudeau's off on the world stage. It's a message that hits home. Simple, powerful, and it could really work.
So it's Trudeau's message of hope and progress versus the Conservatives' call for change and a return to affordability. What's going to tip the scales, do you think?
Well, the economy is going to be huge. If inflation keeps soaring, interest rates keep climbing, it's going to be really tough for Trudeau to convince people he's the right guy to steer the ship through that storm.
Makes sense. When your wallet's hurting, it's hard to focus on anything else, right? Even the most inspiring message of hope can fall flat. What about those concerns about foreign interference? Could that play a role in the election?
Oh, absolutely. If more comes out about, say, Chinese meddling in Canadian elections, that could really damage people's trust in the government. It creates the sense of vulnerability, instability, and that could really benefit the opposition. Trudeau's going to walk a tightrope on that one, balancing national security with the public's right to know.
So we've got the economy, foreign interference, and of course, Trudeau himself, his brand, his ability to connect with voters. Those seem to be the key ingredients in this whole political recipe.
You got it. In the end, it boils down to which party can convince Canadians that they're the ones with the vision, the competence, the leadership to tackle the problems facing this country. And you can never forget the wild card factor. Elections are unpredictable. Some random issue could pop up or some seemingly minor event could suddenly sway public opinion. It's happened before.
We've really dug deep into the weeds here, haven't we? Canadian politics, economics, we've explored the landscape, unpacked Trudeau's vision for the future. What strikes you as the biggest takeaway from all of this?
For me, it's that interconnectedness, how everything's tied together. We saw how those economic anxieties here at home can spill over, shaping Canada's role on the world stage, how personal struggles can impact political leadership, and how the global landscape limits and shapes what's even possible here at home. It's a reminder that we're all in this together, you know? The world's complex. Finding solutions to the big problems, it takes a real understanding of all these moving parts.
Couldn't agree more. It's been an incredible journey, hasn't it? Going beyond the headlines, those snappy sound bites, really getting into the nitty-gritty. And that's what the deep dive is all about, exploring those details, making those connections that might otherwise stay hidden. So what can our listeners do with all this new insight?
Keep digging, keep asking questions. Don't let this be the end of the road. Explore those sources we talked about. Do your own research, talk to people, really get those mental gears turning.
Well said. And hey, if you enjoyed this deep dive, if you want to see more like it, consider becoming a patron. The link's right there in the episode description. Every little bit helps us keep bringing you these thought-provoking explorations. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and drop us a comment letting us know what you thought. We always love hearing from you.
And if you found this deep dive valuable, share it. Tell your friends, family, coworkers, spread the knowledge, keep the conversation going.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of Canadian politics and economics. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those minds engaged.